Hey, Bryden, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Debbie. So honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for accepting my invitation, which you told me before I hit record you thought might have been spam, which is not the first time that's happened, but I saw, I'm sure it was some Instagram or some kind of social media sharing about your new book. And I instantly was like, oh, I got to talk to this guy. So I'm going to name the book now. And then I'm going to ask you to we'll go back and I want to hear a little bit about your
Sounds good.
story. So you are the editor of a wonderful new resource. It's called Neurodiversity-Affirming Occupational Therapy, Empowering Approaches to Foster Neurodivergent Participation. It just ticked so many boxes for me. So I'm really excited to get into it. But I'd love to hear about why you wrote this book and you are so pulled to kind of do this work of changing the system from the inside.
My goodness. Yeah. And I will say too, I'll never say it's my book, it's ours. It was like a beautiful collective of 50 people. And I was truly just honored to even just be the editor and connecting all these wonderful ideas. But as far as my OT journey, I knew I wanted to become an OT in undergrad. I almost became a kindergarten teacher, but I knew I wanted to still dabble in healthcare. And so I don't have a super romantic like story for how I became an OT. Like some of my friends were like, I discovered OT because an OT saved my uncle's life or something like that. I don't have a beautiful romantic story like that, but I literally just Googled, teaching in healthcare, and OT, occupational therapy, was one of the first things to pop up. And I fell in love with the idea that we get to support human beings in participating in skills and life activities that are meaningful to them and kind of on their terms too. And so that's the whole thing too with occupational therapy. A lot of people think occupation, like you must teach children how to find jobs. No child labor. But what we do instead is we support occupational participation. And occupation is any meaningful activity. Like we, as human beings, we're occupational beings. We occupy our time with meaningful activities. And so we get to support human beings in their participation in life. And I like to think of OT as like we're super duper problem solvers. I like to think of life with anything as like this beautiful interaction of the person, the environment, the activity. And if there's like a mismatch in some capacity, we get to totally explore how we can make that into a better match. But my first OT job was actually, I was an occupational therapist for an ABA clinic right out of undergrad or right out of graduate school, and really knowing nothing at all about the neurodiversity community's feedback on ABA. And it was like 3 months in, because in the ABA clinic, occupational and speech therapy were kind of siloed away from like the main center. We had our own little universe, our own little world. And so the behavioral technicians would drop off the clients and we would support and work with them. And I remember one time, one of the technicians dropped off a student and they were carrying like this bag of pom poms. And the student, their favorite way to verbalize, communicate their excitement was through one-liners or scripting from Thomas the Train. And so this behavioral technician told me like, hey, like whenever they start to get really excited and they start scripting Thomas the Train, you need to dump this bag of pom poms. So they pick up each and every single pom pom in order to get them to stop scripting Thomas the Train and instead saying, I'm excited. And I remember thinking in that moment, and I was brand new, like just graduated in 2018. We were taught, behavioral modification stuff was like best practice for supporting children and youth. I knew nothing about neurodiversity at the time, but even then, I was sitting there knowing nothing about neurodiversity or autistic ways of being. I'm sitting here like, what's the big deal? Like, they love Thomas the Train. I love when they script Thomas the Train. I love when they flap their hands, and I join them in scripting with them because we vibe so well, and it's a way of showing enjoyment. And so I was like, LOLs, no, I'm not doing that. Like, you can leave and I'm going to do my own thing. But then I remember that night, like, Googling just like scripting autism perspective. And I stayed up all night just like learning about what scripting was, what stimming was. I discovered what neurodiversity was. And my mind was so blown. And I knew in that moment I needed to get out of that position. And so I left, I think it was like 6 months in, I was able to leave. And then I was an inpatient and outpatient pediatrics, and now I'm in the schools. I love the schools, and I'm learning. I feel like in occupational therapy, I can't speak for other allied health professions. We are so quick to kind of put applied behavioral analysis into this universe of like, it's harmful for autistic and neurodivergent individuals, but everything we do is okay and everything we do like is affirming. And that's so not the case. And a lot of the work that I do right now is outside of the schools is trying to help support OTs in recognizing ableism influences everything we do, from our education, how we evaluate clients, our intervention methods, how we advocate, how we even view what we think their participation should look like. And so that's kind of, I probably just info dumped a lot, but that's kind of where I'm at right now with my OT journey.
No, I so appreciate you sharing that. I mean, I think the topic of ABA, we haven't really talked about it much on the show. We prioritize like DIR floor time and kind of,
Yep.
that kind of thing. And it is one of those things, just to say for listeners, like, I recognize that is what insurance, companies cover. Like that is, and as you said, this is known as like the evidence-based best practices. And we also know what a majority of autistic adults say about their experiences with
Mhm.
ABA. And it is such a complex issue. And so, I just so appreciate your lens and kind of the experience that you had. And I'm just, we didn't plan to talk about this, but I'm just curious, from the inside, therapists who are practicing in ABA,
Yeah.
centers and things, like, you had such a strong gut reaction. Do you think that is the norm, but people are just kind of accepting, well, this is the way that it's done and this is the way that we do things? Like, I'm just curious if that tension, do you see it a
Mm.
lot, or think it's really out there?
I definitely think the tension does exist, and I think it also just depends on one's awareness of neurodiversity and ableism and the roots of and the origins of ABA. I think everyone is on their own journey when it comes to really learning about what neurodiversity is and ableism and how it exists within society and how it influences everything we do. And so I feel like it's a range of, many individuals, are taught that ABA is the gold beautiful standard for supporting autistic and neurodivergent children and youth. And they'll get an education that is primarily provided by those that are within that universe, and have no idea. And then they might read something online about how ABA has been shown to actually be harmful, and they're shocked. And then you have others that maybe like they're recognizing, yeah, ABA is harmful, or I am an occupational therapist. I provided a lot of at the beginning like positive reinforcement because that's what I was taught as like being the gold standard, or supporting neurotypical social skills training because that was the gold standard. And then you look up something online and you realize, oh shoot, I've really been missing the ball, actually been causing harm. And so do I have it within my own capacity, my own like really my own energy capacity to try to be an advocate and work within the system to minimize harm? Or am I going to burn myself out? And you know what? I feel like it can provide more of a difference if I leave and work for a different company or a different environment. And I don't think it's fair to ever say if there's somebody that is a therapist that's working at an ABA clinic and they want to stay in that to help minimize harm. I don't think it's fair for anyone to say that that's ableist, because if you feel like we need those people though too, that can be
Mm-hmm.
within those systems and structures
Mm-hmm.
to help minimize harm. And it's also completely okay to do what I did, thinking I can maybe stay for as long as I could. But it was like month 6, I recognized, no, I feel like I'm getting overwhelmed by just the constant the negativity, the ableism, and I need to leave. I think
Mm-hmm.
all those positions are valid. In a big beautiful world, at like neurodiversity affirming services would be covered by insurance. And in a dream world, instead of ABA, it would be neurodiversity affirming holistic childcare and supports for caregivers. But for a lot of communities, especially for BIPOC families who are historically often kicked out of daycare because of racism and because of how behaviors are viewed, and for a lot of families, families need to work, and ABA centers are the only places that they can have their children watched over. And so I think it's also unfair to say we need to completely get rid of all of it without really exploring how to replace it at the same time, if that makes sense
Absolutely.
too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And let's talk about ableism a little bit more. So,
Yeah.
I think it's something, we've explored ableism on the show before, thinking specifically of the episode we did with Emily Ladau on her book about disability. And it was such a fascinating conversation. And a big part of my work at Tilt has always been encouraging parents to kind of uncover their own ableistic kind of point of view that maybe has never been examined before. So could you talk a little bit about that, maybe through your lens, what you see ableism as being and kind of the ways it may exist in our lives or in practitioners' lives that they may not even know is going on?
Yeah, totally. Ableism is a system of oppression that essentially prioritizes non-disabled minds and bodies over disabled minds and bodies, and it's really connected to capitalism and racism. If you kind of like, let's see, like for example, just in the United States, we are taught that we need to maximize how much we produce outside of school. Like we have to work 40 hours a week, 40 hours a week. We need to work as much as possible. We need to produce as much as possible. And this productivity culture, the grind, is we have such a fascination with it. Like it's so heavily ingrained that this is probably one of the I'm working on a million things with my own inner self, but this is like the hardest thing where I make how much I produce like synonymous with my value as a human being. And that's because of capitalism. And so if you have a disability or if you're disabled in any sort of way, that decreases what society views as what ideal productivity output should look like. That's bad. So we need to fix it so then you produce nearly as much. And so that then leads into like how we work as occupational therapists as we because of how ableism is so intertwined into everything, like we prioritize independence over interdependence with our evaluations. We use a lot of norm reference tools where we compared disabled and neurodivergent individuals to neurotypical and non-disabled individuals because being non-disabled and being neurotypical is the benchmark for functioning. It's the most ideal form of way of being a human being. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. It makes so much sense. And I love that distinction too of independence versus interdependence. I mean, it is so, it's underlying so many things that we don't question. And so it's so important to like shine a light on these ideas that we might be like subconsciously striving for our kids or for our families and be like, wait a minute, why is this the hill we're going to die on? Why are these the things that actually matter? The title of your book is Neurodiversity-Affirming Occupational Therapy. Neurodiversity affirming, I'm using air quotes if you're not watching me on YouTube. I feel like that phrase is everywhere right now. And it's, I've talked with therapy providers in the past. I'm thinking specifically of Dr. Megan Ananeff and
Mm,
Dr. Deborah Brous. She and I, or the three of us, had a really interesting conversation about therapy in general and whether or not they are neurodiversity affirming different modalities. And also the
mhm.
fact that that term seems to be really embraced widely without necessarily people really understanding what it means.
Yes.
So would you kind of unpack it for us? What does it mean to you?
Yes. Are you okay with before I dive into neurodiversity affirming what that means? Are you okay if I could just briefly talk about neurodivergence real quick? Because I feel like there's so many myths and misconceptions about it. So like neurodiversity, as we know, is this really beautiful biological truth that there's an infinite number of ways that we as human beings can experience the world and engage in neurocognitive functioning. And neurodivergence is anyone that deviates from dominating societal norms of what neurocognitive functioning should look like. And that was coined by Cashin Asumisu and in 2000. And so a lot of people think that neurodivergence is synonymous with ADHD and autism, but it's actually not. And even more so, this is some new learning for myself, is being neurodivergent has nothing to do with a medical diagnosis. And so, like, yes, like if you have a change of the brain and if you do have a medical diagnosis, highly likely you are neurodivergent. And that includes any deviation. So it's intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's psychiatric disabilities, it's schizophrenia, it's synesthesia, it's sensory processing differences. It's acquired, like a lot of people don't think about. For many of us, we will become either disabled or neurodivergent at some point in our lives, even just due to aging. And because neurodivergence isn't just with what you're born with. And again, it has nothing to do with the medical diagnosis. So if you are somebody that has a particular way of stimming or just regulating yourself, and you are in an environment where you don't feel comfortable engaging in that regulation strategy, that's neurodivergence. Like that's how dynamic it is. And so when we think about neurodiversity, it's really recognizing that neurodivergence and disability, we have our own culture. Like we talk about, like we don't often talk about how disability, we have our own multiverse of cultures. There's autistic culture, ADHD culture, voice hearing culture, deaf culture, and and we have our own norms and characteristics. And for me, at least within occupational therapy, being neurodiversity affirming means we support neurodivergent individuals and their occupational participation and well-being on their terms, not defining their success and participation outcomes by what society tells us it should look like, but from on their terms, like from their perspective, what does neurodivergent like well-being and neurodivergent flourishing in life look like for them? If
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that definition. First of all, I think language is so fascinating in this space in particular, and how it's changing and evolving, and people are kind of uh, always, claiming different language, or kind of
Yeah.
incorporating and integrating it into their worldviews and experiences in different ways. So to hear you describe neurodivergence as being that's a more inclusive or broader umbrella than I have heard before, especially that idea of acquiring certain things. So that is kind
Hmm.
of a newer lens for me.
Oh yeah, and like Cashin, like she purposely made the term intentionally super duper inclusive. It's not meant to be a gatekeeping identifier. It has nothing to do with like the medical world. It's a socio-political identity, and that's like the whole point about it. It's super beautiful and super cool.
So how are people misusing, if that's the right word, the term neurodiversity affirming when they are, maybe they do have an occupational therapy practice or other sort of therapeutic practice that's supporting families, and they say we're
Mm,
neurodiversity affirming, but they're kind of
yeah.
sticking it there, but it may not be actually in line or aligned with what the services they're
Ah,
providing.
yeah. I think so. A lot of people, what I've been seeing, I like to think, I like to believe, well-intentioned, best interest at heart always, and especially with the conversations around neurodiversity becoming much more prominent. I think I mean, it's really catchy, and people want neurodiversity affirming services and supports. And so I think what I've been finding and what I've been seeing is even just maybe switching language. So, like, I've seen organizations that have historically published literature that is not very affirming. And so they'll just use identity first language when talking about autistic individuals, which at large, a lot of autistic individuals prefer identity first language, but then they'll think that's it. Like, they'll just change the language on their website and be like, okay, that's all the learning on our end. We don't need to
Yeah.
do anything else. Or it's a lot of people, what some of us will call like neurodiversity light, where maybe your services, you don't force eye contact, you don't work on neurotypical social skills, and you don't do hand over hand. So therefore, I am neurodiversity affirming, and I no longer have no more work that I need to do. And for me, neurodiversity affirming means we really go beyond like these superficial adjustments to really deep diving into our work and really recognizing how ableism influences everything we do, and we really unpack that really tough stuff. And it's lifelong. Like, you're not going to take like one training or read one book and be like, okay, I'm neurodiversity for affirming for forever. Like, I don't have to do anything else. But even for myself, like, I'm multiply neurodivergent. I'm an autistic ADHD with depression, and every day I still make mistakes, and I'm still unpacking my own internalized ableism. And that's the hard stuff that we really need to be navigating if we really want to be neurodiversity affirming.
Yeah, and I think it takes so much intention, right?
Hmm.
It's because again, it's so kind of ingrained in the water we're swimming in, and so it does take work, I imagine, and to unpack all of that takes commitment and access to resources, which this book is one such resource. But what is it like out there for practitioners who are having this discovery and they want to change course, like, is it hard to find access to training or resources that would help them along this journey?
I think it's much easier now than it was 4 or 5 years ago. I do think a lot of the resources out there are very focused on pediatric, like children and youth, like neurodivergent children and youth. We still have very little resources for neurodivergent adults or even the transition age from like public education and into the world. And that was also why too, with our book, because we had to cut down so much. I think the original book was like 550 pages, and the publisher was like, "No, we want this to be like really accessible. It's
Yeah.
not a formal textbook." And so like one of the downloads, it's like a bonus chapter of case studies of different neurodivergent OTs. It's like, because being neurodiversity affirming is a true art, and it's different how every person embeds it within their practice. And so we have a bunch of case studies, but I think no, 4 of the 5 are adult specific for that very reason, because there's very little resources for supporting neurodivergent adults.
So I would love if you could walk us through the Empower model, which is a neurodiversity affirming OT framework. Would you kind of talk us through that?
Yes. So the Empower model was, yeah, it was actually kind of an accident, a beautiful accident. So in 2023, I graduated with my post-professional doctorate in OT from Boston University, and my doctoral project was creating a neurodiversity affirming toolkit for OTs to really kind of essentially unpack ableism throughout like this anti-ableist OT process, and then also what they could do um, in practice. And as a part of the doctoral project, you have to have a model or a framework to be the center of it. And there are a lot of really great holistic occupational therapy frameworks. But none of these frameworks either focus on what participation looks like for a neurodivergent person, and none of them really require to really reflect on our own ableism and how that impacts us as OTs. And so I already did a literature review for another part of my project where I basically explored what neurodivergent advocates want out of therapy. And I remember my husband and I, we were huge reality TV fans. I think we were watching The Housewives of Salt Lake City at the time. That's what was really big for us at the time. And we were talking, and I remember mentioning to him my frustrations of like, I'm having a hard time picking a model because it's not really what I'm looking for. He's like, well, you already did like the review. Like, why don't you just give it a go? And I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, like your advisor will just tell you if it's like not good or not, and they'll provide feedback. And so then that's where the Empower model came from. So basically, I did this literature review where I didn't just do research, because neurodivergent individuals, though marginalized individuals, are often excluded from peer-reviewed published literature. So I actually prioritized resources and blogs that were created by neurodivergent individuals, and there were common themes that were found for what's considered neurodiversity affirming practice. So that's what leads to us to like the 4 foundations around the outside. So it's strengths-based approaches, anti-racism, disability justice, and trauma-informed care. And then they're all kind of connected by like these bonds of lived experience. I'm like a huge video gamer, science nerd, and so like the Empower model looks kind of like a distorted atom. And then in the center of it, what I like to call the anti-ableist occupational therapy process. And so it's this cycle that's critical reflexivity, inclusive evaluations, affirming services and supports, neurodivergent outcomes, and advocacy. And so essentially the Empower model is designed as this practical framework to really provide a structured approach for how OTs can integrate the principles of neurodiversity affirming practice into their therapy work, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you mentioned inclusive evaluations, and I actually kind of want to do a wee little detour over there to
Yeah.
talk about that, because that's something that comes up a lot in this process. It's something most parents of a neurodivergent kid, they're going to go through one or multiple assessments with their children. So could you describe, when you say an inclusive evaluation, what would that actually look like, or how might it differ from
Yeah,
your kind of standard
totally.
assessment?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna, because most of my current experience is school. So like, for example, in the public schools, so like maybe a more ableist deficit based OT evaluation would be, we send out we do a maybe a norm reference sensory assessment where we ask teachers to rate, basically fill out this questionnaire to see how quote unquote bad a student's sensory processing experiences are, or how far they deviate from the norm. And then help maybe we maybe help collaborate on writing goals that are super not affirming, where maybe we talk about like where the student has to do like size of the problem and stuff like that. Or maybe we don't even ask, well, actually, the biggest piece that would make it super deficit based is we don't even ask the student for their own lived experience. I think that was the one thing I was very surprised about when I came into the schools is we have, you know, individualized education plans, we have evaluations within special education. They're all about the student, and yet the student's voice is like rarely, if ever, incorporated. And so for me, what I do is I first off like always do a strengths-based student interview. So I love asking students like, hey, like what are your favorite parts of school? What parts of school are really, really hard? What is something that you really would love to, what's another skill you'd love to learn about? What do you want to be when you grow up? And then like, I always love to ask them too, like, hey, like we're going to be writing an IEP, like a plan to basically support you. What do you want to be on your IEP? And I'll like go through all the different areas that an IEP can entail, and the student will kind of pick like, I want to work on my reading skills, I want to work on making more friends, and those are the areas that I'll advocate for then at their initial IEP or eval results meeting. Like, hey, I get that you all think this is what's really important, but we also need to really focus on and incorporate what the student shared is their priorities, because their voice
Mhm.
matters the most.
Yeah.
um, I always observe the student during parts of the day that are the most challenging, not necessarily to see like from like what deficits exist, but also are there environmental barriers. So like I will, whenever I observe students in their general education classroom, I always will kind of gauge like, what is the teacher's attitudes towards neurodivergence or disability? Are they kind of having like these under the table rules that students need to do whole body listening? They can't access accommodations. They can't use adapted seating. There's like these like hard line rules, and will kind of also like look at how sensory inclusive their classroom is. Like, do they have their fluorescent lights covered? There's a lot of visual stuff on the walls, and so I really like to think of my portions of evaluations as very trying to amplify the student's perspective and their voice in evaluations. And I can't even tell you the number of times where like I feel like no one really reads my portions of the eval sometimes anyway, because it's always such a massive document. But I'll get emails, or even at these meetings, family members will be like, hey, like, which one of you is Bryden the OT? And I'll be like, oh yeah, that's me. And they'll be like, hey, like, we really loved how you wrote your reports. Like, it was the first time we've ever felt like our child was really fully seen, because even how I write it is very strength based. It's not like Johnny has a deficit in X, Y, and Z. It's like Johnny has strengths and interests in this area, and this is how we can adapt their learning in the environment to amplify their learning profile, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's great. As you were sharing that, it made me think of two conversations that I'm going to encourage listeners to check out. One is I recently interviewed Dr. Destiny Huff, who she's great, right? She has a great website and resources, and her book, which we talk about, is Neurodiversity-Affirming Advocacy, and she is a powerhouse and has a lot of great insights, especially for those kind of IEP conversations and in the school. And then also Dr. Jade Rivera. And we talked about strength-based assessments and IEP goals. So those would
Cool.
be like a nice companion
Mm.
listen to this conversation. But I guess what I'm wondering is, what do you see in terms of the openness, especially like in school systems and, people doing this work in these bigger systems? We know that change is like slow, the bigger and more bureaucratic certain systems are. So, could you talk a little bit about the climate that your book is coming out in now? And if you do see an openness to integrating some of these ideas?
Yeah, I think it really just depends on the individual. I mean, I I do a lot of things I think very differently than what a lot of I think typical school-based OTs do. Like I mean, yes, I assess fine motor and handwriting, but that's like 5%. Like my teams know that I am very much into supporting the student's well-being, positive identity, mental health. And so because of that, I think more often than not, a lot of I have really good relationships with my case managers, my special education teachers. And I feel like, I mean, it's like a kind of like a bell curve. Some folks are much more open to these conversations than others. And what I love to share, because I do presentations actually across our district with our admin, because thank goodness I love, love, love my director, and our administration is special education administration is really wanting to be more trauma informed and neurodiversity affirming and strengths based in special education in our district. And what I like to share is that public education, special education, like the system doesn't have to like, and neurodiversity affirming doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. Like our IEPs can be strength based. They don't need to be deficit based. Like they just need to demonstrate a need, and the team just needs to work on creating a plan to like illustrate what that support will look like. Um, like one of my other roles too is that I advocate for is, at least in the United States, in order to have a behavior plan, you need to do a functional behavioral assessment. And that's a whole nother conversation about how FBAs or how we do behavior plans are very ableist and can cause harm. And so like my role is I advocate to be a part of any behavior planning meeting to help minimize the harm of the FBAs and the behavior plans and try to incorporate the student's voice. And I do want to share though too, I mean, especially for parents, like I can't even imagine, because both Zach and I, we're not dads yet, and I can't even imagine like the amount of pressure to feel like you always have to fight over and over again, whether it's a goal, whether it's how a report is written, like the ableism. And I also like want to affirm that you're not a bad parent, you're not a bad ally or bad advocate to your child if you feel like you don't take on every single opportunity, because you will burn yourself out. And so not that like anyone like needs my permission, but like I hope like there's like this exhale where you feel like you don't need to take on every single moment of like that's ableist during a meeting, or that you don't have to try to tackle everything, because you will burn yourself out, and
Yeah.
that's okay to not do that.
Mm-hmm. No, I really appreciate that. And I think what heartens me is so many of the conversations I have are with people like you who are changing systems from the inside and doing important work. Like, this is how paradigm shift, this is how the
Hmm.
change happens. And so, I guess as a way to kind of wrap up, I'm thinking of listeners, and most of our listeners are our parents, but we also have therapists and educators who listen to this show. How can we, and I'm talking to all you guys out there listening, like partner with their OTs, with your work, with this book? Like, how can we kind of amplify the work that you're doing in our own lives? Do you have any ideas for that?
Yeah, honestly, I think one really relatively easy thing you can do is just checking your social media feeds. Checking, who do you follow? Do you follow neurodivergent advocates? Do you only follow, like, this was great learning for myself too. Like, a good call in for myself is, do you only follow white neurodivergent advocates? And so just really making sure that, like, even like where are you getting your information from, I think is a really easy way. And just so then you can, social media is powerful when it comes to allowing neurodivergent voices to really be at the forefront. And so just trying to get a lot of your information that way. But also, coming from a super anxious person, like not even taking my own advice, do my best whenever I can, but don't be afraid to ask questions, and don't be afraid to be open-heartedly curious. I think even just having these conversations in and of themselves is super important and super critical. And when you're in a clinic, it's really easy to feel like you can create your own affirming world, because what you do is just kind of more one-on-one with the families involved. But when you're in like a school system, it's so much more complex. Like best practice isn't just working with the student one-on-one, like it's changing the minds of teachers, paraprofessionals, administration, and kind of what you mentioned, Abby, like slow is fast, and really try to celebrate the quote unquote small wins. Like the
Mhm.
first year when I was in the schools, I was so defeated because I was like, if I don't change everything of how we do evaluations, I'm failing as a neurodivergent advocate. And I was like feeling disappointed about coming to work, and I really had to change my mindset about really celebrating those steps. So like if a parent has a 5-minute conversation with a teacher and they feel heard from the teacher, like that's such a big success. Or if you're a therapist that provides an idea that changes how a paraprofessional does behavior management with a student that's more affirming, like just from a very quick conversation, or they watch what you're doing and they were like, hey, I like that, I want to do that next time. That's a massive big win. And
Yeah.
so trying to really celebrate those like smaller but super powerful
Yeah.
wins.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. It all matters. All of
It
it. It all
does.
matters. And
It
every
all
little.
builds.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to name your book one more time. And then if you could share where listeners can learn more about you and Neurodivergent Nexus, that would be great. So, the book is Neurodiversity-Affirming Occupational Therapy, Empowering Approaches to Foster Neurodivergent Participation. It's an anthology, really. It's a collection of writing from
Yeah. Oh, I
many
love
people.
that.
And
Yeah.
I think it's a good read for anybody to better understand, what's happening on the inside and how we can all participate in this shift. But you also have other resources that parents might want to check out. So, where can parents learn more and connect?
Yes. So parents, therapists, anyone listening, they can find me. So you can just do neurodivergentot.com or neurodivergentnexus.com. I also do have an Instagram, which is Bryden Carlson-Giving. I will say I'm really bad at posting, but I do my best to upload resources and all that when I have some spare time. But yeah, I hope some of the resources are helpful. There's a whole website page that's dedicated to the book. So if you're even just kind of curious about all the different chapters and what we talk about, it's a really good place to start.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So, listeners, as always, I will have links in the show notes pages to those resources as well as the episodes I mentioned and some other things that came up in our conversation. So, check that out. And Bryden, thank you. I so enjoyed this conversation and also that we got to go down like little rabbit holes. It's always my favorite kind of interview to do. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Debbie. It was a super duper honor. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.